All right, we're ready for Judges chapter 8. Gideon subdues the Midianites. Everybody had a good week? Missy has had a miserable week. I am so thankful. Y'all don't realize I am very thankful that we can kid this congregation. And I've run into some that, as the old preacher says, they were weaned on a sour persimmon. And it just does not match my personality at all. So anyway, I'm glad we can kid. Means a lot. Gideon. We've been in the midst of Gideon. We're going to finish Gideon up tonight as we finish this chapter, hopefully. And as we think about Gideon, we think about a man that, first of all, had to be convinced. Back in chapter 7, he had to be convinced that he needed to lead the children of Israel. He had to be convinced that he could do it. And as he became convinced, he eventually took on the challenge of leading Israel. As he led them well, but he became an individual that became almost ruthless and arrogant. And as we see tonight, they're going to ask him after he defeats the Midianites to be king. And it's interesting because as we look at the text, and I'm going to go on and tell you this, so in case I don't point it out as we're talking about it, it seems to me that he assumed maybe the role of king without the title. In other words, he took on the finery. He took on the good things, let people honor him and wealth and things of that nature. But he didn't take on the role of the king. And so you might say he had the pleasures without the power, or the pleasures without the pressures of the title. Well, let's look at it. We know that Ephraim was a great tribe at the time. And the men of Ephraim came up against Gideon. Gideon had done a good thing when you stop and think about it. I know Gideon is not the righteous individual. It's interesting, and that's a point we should make in the review, is that Gideon never really followed God. Now, there's a point in here where it seems like, well, maybe he's softening up, maybe he's following God a little bit, but he was raised by Baal worshipers. He did have a hand in destroying his father's idol, but nevertheless, it's noteworthy that at the end of this chapter, one of the things he does is he leads the children of Israel back into idolatry. But as Gideon led the children of Israel, Ephraim, the nation, the tribe of Ephraim, gets upset because the Midianites, who had been coming in for several years and just raiding Israel, raiding everything, the crops and everything that they could get their hands on, and now Gideon has got them on the run. And Ephraim gets upset. Notice what they say. Why have you done this to us? By not calling us when you went to fight the Midianites. And they reprimanded him sharply, they vigorously, severely. They weren't kind. It wasn't, hey, why didn't you come get us? They were ugly to him. So here's what he said to them, verse 2. What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? There we go, Abzar. Abzar was the family name for Gideon's family. He says, aren't you better off? Aren't you better off doing what you were doing in the fields than doing what he claims his family, or at least himself, was doing? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? In other words, you had it easier, you had it better. You weren't out following these fellas, you weren't out fighting these individuals. You were out working the fields, you were out doing the things that were necessary for you. And of course, we might say, well, now wait a minute. God trimmed the army down to 300. That's right. So why is Ephraim upset? Well, this is the note for leaders of all kinds. Whatever you do, you're going to be criticized. It's too hot. It's too cold in the building. It's too this. It's too that. We're doing this and we should be doing that. It doesn't matter. When individual leads, she sets themselves up for criticism. And the reality is you can't please everybody. I share the story of a congregation I was working with. And one lady came out, same service. One lady came out and talked about the beautiful singing. I didn't preach that day, so she talked about the wonderful preaching. The prayers, the service was just so uplifting. In a few minutes, another sister walked out. If y'all don't get that air conditioner fixed where it's not so cold, I will never be back. It was awful here. It was terrible. The worship service was terrible. Same service, folks. Same service. Difference between grouch and a non-grouch, I guess. I don't know. But it just sets yourself up. Leaders set themselves up. And ultimately, you could say, well, Gideon sort of accomplished that. But he was able. One of the good things about it is that he was able to smooth them over. Because they pretty much said, yeah, you're right. We had it pretty good, and you had it a little rough. Their anger toward him subsided when he said that. And when Gideon, verse 4, came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted, but still in pursuit. Now think about this. He has his 300 men. They've come to the Jordan. Now, remember, I gave you a map last week. I just wanted you to kind of get a feel for what was going on. Basically, from where they were, where they started, if you will, they went due east towards the Jordan River and towards the Jordan River Valley and went down south towards the Dead Sea and crossed over. Not yet, but they're eventually going to cross over. Gideon is in pursuit with his men. And as he is crossing over the Jordan, his men are weary. They're exhausted, but they're still following. Then he said to the men of Succoth, which was east of the Jordan. So now we've crossed over the Jordan. Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they exhausted. And I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. I am on this side of the Jordan River. My men are exhausted. Can you help us out? Can you give them a little bread? Can you give them something to eat? They are famished. And a good army fights on what? Stomach, right? So Gideon, knowing that, just ask the men of Succoth, the folks of Succoth, if they will help them out. The leaders of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand that we should give bread to your army? I want you to think about something. This is east of the Jordan River, right? The folks that settled, when we settled, remember the land in the book of Joshua? And remember, we had Ephraim and Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh settled on the east side of the Jordan River. And remember, it was allowed. And what was the agreement? Do you remember? They had to go over and fight. And guess what? They never did. They never went. The agreement was you can settle east of the Jordan River, but you have to go over and fight. They never did. It didn't help Deborah. They didn't help Gideon. And now notice that Gideon just asked bread from just something to eat. And they said, you hadn't caught them yet. When you get finished the task, maybe so. And so Gideon said, for this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness, with the briars. He got mean on them, didn't he? He was upset. We'll go on and say, because I know you've studied this before, but just a reminder, he comes back and does what he says. It's sad to say, but we do reap what we sow. And yet, why these folks wouldn't help them, well, who knows? But yet, at the same time, too, while they wouldn't help him, look what he says. He says, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to discipline you. I'm going to teach you a lesson. Matter of fact, we're going to see a word here in a few minutes that uses that idea. Some translations, translate it discipline, and some translate it teach. Well, it's in dealing with the men of Succoth. We'll talk about it here in a few minutes when we get there. But there's the promise. So verse 8, then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, when I come back in peace, I'll tear down this tower. These folks, they wasn't willing to help. So, all right, well, if you're going to be that way, then I'm going to come down and I'm going to take care of you as well. And so we enter into a second battle. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor. Karkor was thought to be, and we don't know because we don't have real confirmation of this, but Karkor was thought to be about 100 miles east of the Dead Sea. So we're really past the Jordan Valley, or the River Jordan Valley, and we're on up out of that, if you will, a ways. And their armies were with them, about 15,000, all who were left, all the army of the people of the east. For 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. So here's the casualties. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents from the east of Nobah and Zogbehah. And he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle, from the ascent of Hares, and he caught a young man with the men of Succoth and interrogated him, and he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. Let's just stop right there for a minute. So we have this second battle that Gideon engages in, and Gideon is successful. But notice on the way back, he catches a young man from Succoth, and he interrogates him. And the young man was able to write down the leaders. Now, some have said, some speculated, maybe correct, maybe not correct, that since this man could write down the leaders, that maybe he served in a higher role than just being a young man, and maybe he was a scribe or something of that nature. We don't know. It doesn't tell us. But it does tell us that he was able to write down the leaders of Succoth and its elders. Elders meaning elder men, elder men, leaders. There was about 77 of them that he wrote down. Anything else before we venture on? So then he came to the men of Succoth and he said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me. He said, you remember the fellows you taunted me about that I hadn't caught yet? That's these two guys right here. And so he sort of rubs it in their face. And then he says to them, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men. And he took the elders of the city and the thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Taught. That's the word I was talking about a while ago. Some say taught, some say discipline. And the word can mean, I don't know of a translation that uses this, but the word can mean torture. So he tortured these fellows. He tortured the men of Succoth. He tortured them. Why? Because he says, you harassed me. You ridiculed me. You taunted me. And so I'm sure he gave it back to them in kind. And then he went to Penuel, verse 17, and he tore down the tower and he killed the men of the city, just like he said. So we find really here, just stopping right here and thinking for a minute, we find that Gideon is ruthless. This is a great reminder right here that God uses us and uses us to serve his purpose. And sometimes God uses ruthless men, folks that, you might say, well, he's not a God-fearer. That doesn't mean God doesn't use him, though. And here is a man that's ruthless, Gideon. It's interesting because when you first open the story in the 6th chapter, you see a man, at least my perception, maybe reading into it a little bit more than maybe I should, but my perception of Gideon is that he is kind of a meek, mild-mannered individual. Yeah, not a follower of God, but just kind of just easygoing. But he turns into a warrior, and he turns into one that is going to make sure that he's listened to. You might say, some might say, well, he was really, in many senses, a good captain for an army, because you had to be ruthless, really, in that day and age, if you were going to be a fighter, a warrior, soldier. I mean, it was hand-to-hand combat, bloody, hard, day-long fighting. But nevertheless, Gideon, a man who was not a man of God, was used by God. Then, verse 18, he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? This is a little switch. All of a sudden here you have a little switch. And so Gideon is asking these two kings, the Midianites, he says, well, some men that you killed at Tabor. We don't really have much background on this, but we notice that he says, tell me about them. So they answered him, as you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. Now, it's interesting because notice verse 19. What does Gideon say? They were my brothers. And if you recall back in the 6th chapter, 15th verse, one of the things that Gideon said about his family was that his family was one of the poorest families around. And so here these two kings say, well, the men that we killed at Tabor, they were like you. They were kings. They looked like they were kin to kings. They resembled kings. But Gideon says, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. And he said to Jether, some say Jether, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid because he was still a youth. Now, Gideon had two brothers, at least. He had more, evidently, but he has two brothers that were older. Remember, we can say they were older because in the 6th chapter, one of the things he says, too, is not only that his family was poor, but he says he's the youngest. He's not the oldest, he's the youngest. And so he says, I'm going to kill you. But he turns to his son, his firstborn, and he tells him to rise and kill them. But he's just an adolescent. He's just a youth. The word youth there is the idea of an adolescent. Soldier and a king in biblical times. Their, if you will, their remembrance and how high up they were lifted was based upon who really killed them. So their prestige rose if somebody of high standing killed them. Now, Gideon knows that. So Gideon's going to get an adolescent to kill them to make sure that their prestige is not very high. But this young man, Jether, he said, no, I don't think so. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise yourself and kill us. For as a man is, so is his strength. So Gideon arose, killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. Gideon took the family revenge. You remember back in the old law? You remember the idea of the kinsman redeemer? The kinsman redeemer, the next of kin, that if someone was killed in your family, the next of kin could go and kill them. But then if the individual that killed, especially by accident, killed somebody, what could they do? Where could they go? City of refuge, right. But it was common, might not like it, the idea really is gruesome, but it was a common practice. So when Gideon, if you will, took the lives of Zebah and Zalmunna, he was enacting this family revenge. That was part of the way they lived. And so he killed them, and he took the crescents. Now, we're not real sure what these crescents were. It would seem to me, because of what is said a little bit later on as Gideon is going to make an ephod, is that these crescents were probably valuable. It may have some way been some sort of ornaments, if you will, because notice that it says they were ornaments that were on their camels' necks that showed their position. They were kings. It could have been that they were ornaments that were costly, but also they were of prestige. And so what Gideon does is he takes them sort of as a trophy. You've heard of, I'm sure you've seen it on TV. You've probably watched enough cop shows because that's seemingly all that's on. But these individuals that are well, we call them psychos. There's other words for them. But that kill people and then take trophies. You know, it could be anything. It could be a lock of hair or whatever that they take from their victims, and then they display them somewhere somehow, kind of as a reminder of what they've done. Well, Gideon takes these ornaments off of their animals, off of their camels' necks as a trophy of sorts. And so what do we see? Well, we see the ruthlessness of the time. We see the revenge that a man invokes upon others because of family death. We see really a lot of heartache, hurt, bloodshed, just really a gruesome chapter in the Bible. But it's all part of this bigger picture. If you stop and think about what is the Bible? The Bible is God's revelation of himself, but it's also not only God's revelation of himself, but God's revelation of himself as he saves mankind. And so you see this story in the Old Testament of God loving a nation and protecting the nation and doing what he could for and with the nation. Now think about these kings. Think about Zebah and Zalmunna. What had they been doing for years to the children of Israel? Raiding them, right? Coming in and taking everything. And God had acted revenge for his children upon them. God is showing through a bigger picture, all the Old Testament now, but God is showing through a bigger picture how that he takes care of his children, how that he watches over them, how that he makes sure that they're all right for the ultimate end of salvation, of course. Anything anybody like to say about all of this? Mm-hmm. Do I didn't hear? Yeah, right. Drink. Yeah. No, it's a great thought. I don't know. I don't know. Could be. I don't remember um, what the meaning of the name of the place is, but um, that's a good question. Good thought. Anything else? Or does anybody know the answer to that? Well, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna go back there and take an elder with me and ask if they're studying the Bible. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. All right. Well, let's go now and look at Gideon. Gideon makes an ephod. What was an ephod? Like a breastplate, could be made out of linen. The high priest wore one made out of linen. Remember what it was? How would you say this? Decorated. That's not the right word, but anyway, do you remember what it was decorated with? Precious stones were attached on front. Don't ask me how, because I don't really know. I just know they didn't have Elmer's glue then, not yet, but they were attached to the front of the ephod. Also, ephods were worn not only by those of the priesthood, but also idolaters wore them. And there's a belief in this text, as we'll read it here in just a second, that Gideon actually put this ephod upon the idol Baal. And we'll see that in just a minute. But he's going to make an ephod. Let's read it. The men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us. Now, the idea of rule over us, be our king. Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. Kind of interesting, isn't it? I want you to think about something for just a second. Did you see what, and remember what it said about Jether? What did it say with regards to Gideon? It was his firstborn, right? Now come down here in verse 22. Both you and your son, singular. Make what you will from that. But your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of the Midian. So they saw him as a great leader. They saw him as somebody that had saved them. And so they wanted to put him up and put him on as a king. Well, Gideon didn't want to have anything to do with this. In verse 23, we see his response from their request. He says, I'll not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. That seems like an admirable response, doesn't it? We're going to let God rule you, not me, but God. Then Gideon said to them, I'd like to make a request of you. And so he makes a request. He says that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder. Well, that's asking a lot. Hey, you know all that you got? He says, I want you to take your earrings, I want you to take your gold earrings, and I want you to bring them in and give them to me. Notice what he says. He says, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Who were the Ishmaelites? Yeah. Right. 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 They were wanderers. They were known to have gold. And so, yes, he says, bring me your gold earrings. And so they answered, we will gladly give them. They spread out a garment, and each man threw it into it the earrings from his plunder. That to me is just that's an interesting thing. It shows that they really did appreciate, love Gideon. Say what you want to about him. But they were full-fledged right in there with him. Okay, you want our gold? Well, here's some of our earrings. Here's some of our plunder. And notice what it says. It says, now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. Best we can tell, that's somewhere between 40 to 75 pounds of gold. Besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, purple robes that were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. It would appear as if, remember those ornaments on the camels? That they had chains and that they were probably worth something. To what and how big were they? Don't know. Doesn't say. But they threw them in as well. And then Gideon made into an ephod and set it up in his city. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. So Gideon is leading the children of Israel back into idolatry. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they left their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. So you really have the story coming full circle. Nobody wanted to mess with that part of the world because of Gideon and what he had done with regards to the children of Israel. But yeah, yeah, it is interesting to me, and I thought about that today when I was studying this again. To me, it would appear that Gideon, at least in thought, was a follower of God, but not may have never been fully committed, or that maybe at one time he was, but he went back, thus falling away. I don't know, but it is interesting because it does seem he starts out and there in the 7th chapter last week, it seemed as if to me that Gideon was beginning to come to God. Use that term loosely, okay? But you understand what I'm talking about. He had not been raised that way. He had not been one that had followed in God's steps. He'd been raised as a Baal worshiper, and seemingly he had done that. But in the 7th chapter, he was beginning to say, okay, hey, there's God. But you get into the 8th chapter, and he leads them back into idolatry. Did he ever really follow God? Don't know. Text doesn't tell us, and we don't really know. But it is interesting that he does seemingly flip flop. Why? I don't know. Anything else? Yeah. I don't know. It doesn't say. It just says the men of Israel. Yeah. Yeah. Cargoes almost. Yeah. 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 Well, it was just the plunder of what they got, but they got it from thousands. So of the soldiers. So yeah, I don't know. But how? How many do you have to appoint a king? That's a good question. I just don't have an answer because the scriptures don't say. Anything else? Good stuff, though. Good thought. Okay, well, let's finish this right quickly so we can at least talk about a couple of the lessons. Then Zerubbabel, remember that's Gideon, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. See? Why did it say a while ago son, singular? Don't know. I don't know. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now, yet who Abimelech is, because Abimelech is next week in our study. Abimelech's name can mean a lot of different things. It can mean my father is king. It can mean my God, or God is my king. And so Abimelech is a son of Gideon. He has many. Now, Gideon, the son of Joash, died at good old age. Do you remember who else was said to have died at good old age? Yeah, but that's not who I was thinking about. Go back in the book of Genesis. Okay, that's your research question. But yes, Moses was old, yes. No, well, he was, but it was said of a particular individual he died in a good old age. That's what I'm thinking about with regards to that question. And he was buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, in Ophrah of the I never can say this, Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with Baals and made Baal Berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Zerubbabel, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. Let's remember something. I'm not excusing the actions of verses 33, 34, and 35. I'm not excusing their actions. But I want you to remember time has passed. And as time passes, we tend to forget. Right? As time passes, we tend to forget. These folks had had some time. Time had been good. It had passed. They forgot the good that Gideon had done for them. They forgot the good that God had done for them. They turned to idols and they turned upon Gideon and his legacy. It reminds us of people today. It reminds us of really the importance of remembering, trying to remember. We talk about forgetting the past and moving on. And I do believe that life is about moving on. I do believe that the Bible teaches that. I mean, if you think about it, the Bible talks about moving on from guilt and moving on from discouragement and moving on from bad circumstances and moving on from wicked people and moving on. But it also teaches an aspect that is important, and that is that while we move on, we learn from history. We learn from the past. The great passage of Romans 15:4. Remember what Paul wrote? The things that were written aforetime were written for our what? Learning. Yeah. That we through patience and admonition of the scriptures might have hope. And when you go back to Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, where it's talking about being a great nation, the children of Israel, one of the things that it does is it says, go back to, I'm paraphrasing now, mind you, but it says, go back and remember the history of the past. It's important that we remember the past, the good and the bad. And these folks had forgotten it. Anything else? Because the women are going to come out here in a minute. I guess they're going to laugh their way out here, but they're going to come out here. I'm glad they're laughing. Well, let me give you some lessons that you can gain, or I gained from reading and studying this chapter times past and this time as well. First of all, If you can't help, don't hinder. You remember Ephraim? There's always going to be critics. But if you can't help, don't hinder. Get in there and help if you can. Help your brother in time of need, verse 6. Get in there and do what you can and make the most of your efforts. Next, this is kind of a weird take on things, but if you look in verse 4, don't stop just because you're tired. Now, that doesn't mean don't rest. I'm not saying that. Jesus rested. We need rest. The body rest is important to the body. But go out and rest maybe for a little while and then come back. It's sad through the years that I've watched people talk about, I'm going to use it for instance, and I'm not shooting this at anybody, but I'm just going to use it for an instance because I've had it happen several times. Somebody has taught for several years, Bible school, and they're tired of teaching. And you get to that point and they say, I just need a rest and then I'll come back. Great. That's fine. I have no objection to that at all either. And then they never come back. Oh, they're asked, would you take this class? Would you teach? No. If you're tired, get a rest, but come back. Just because you're weary, don't stop. Next, be careful what you value. Gideon seemed to value the material things. He really didn't, in many ways, he didn't value God. He didn't value the people. Another thing is, and we're all changing. You know, we're all evolving. Whether we like to really admit it or not, we all are. It's called growth in many ways. We're growing. You know, we're learning new things. We're studying new things. New ways are coming about. Gideon changed as well. Sadly, he didn't change for the better. He became seemingly materialistic. He really didn't take stock of himself. And he evidently didn't monitor his faith or his growth, which ultimately caused him to lead the people astray. So be careful how you change. We talked about this for a while, not spend any more time on it, but God uses even the corrupt. He uses Gideon. And Gideon was not a righteous man, according to what we're told. But there's a reminder for all of us. Oops, sorry. And that is, be careful who you follow. When you think about Gideon leading them to idolatry, and it reminds us that we need to be careful who we follow, who we listen to. That's a special lesson as well that sometimes talk to young people about, but also I've talked to young preachers about, because young preachers are bad about following somebody. We all did, are, and we need to be careful. You know, there's a lot of folks out there that don't teach what's true and what's right, and folks begin to jump on their bandwagon and follow them. And that's a very dangerous situation. Anything else? Any other lesson that you might have learned? Good one. And it is. It is. Apostasy is one generation away. Always is. And I suppose always will be. And it reminds us as parents and as grandparents, do the best we can. But ultimately, that next generation has to make up their own mind. And so, as parents and grandparents, we can't make our children or our grandchildren have our faith. But we need to exemplify and teach our faith to them in a way such that they learn to love and appreciate the same things we did and not despise the things that we love. You know, you hear parents talk about, well, I got to go to church tonight and things of that nature. And it's sad. We're not any different, to be honest, than anybody else. I was talked to several people recently about this. They've all brought it up to me, and that is everybody's Sunday night attendance is suffering. Why is that? Well, it's a lot of things. People listen to the world. People listen to the things, the teachers of the world. Some people think that they don't need as much religion as others, so they don't need to come back. Some 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 just think, the Lord said, "Well, just meet on Sunday." Well, it did, but it didn't tell you how often and when, from the standpoint of mornings or night. I've always said, and I may be really weird about this, but if I was only going to come one time on Sunday, I'd come on Sunday night. You know why? Because usually the preacher preaches more of a feel-good sermon than he does a get after you sermon. He preaches that on Sunday morning. I get to sleep in, take my time on Sunday morning, have a good meal, then come to church. That's just me though. But folks come only on Sunday morning. Who knows what their issue is? I'll say this, and I realize this is a blunt, bold statement, but we talk about doing what God says. But when we don't follow what our elders say, and by the way, Hebrews 13 reminds us to obey them that have the rule over you. That would include elders. Then we are, in essence, when we don't do what they say, and they say we're going to meet at 6 o'clock, and we don't come back, we are thumbing our nose at our elders, but we're thumbing our nose at God. And a lot of us don't think about that. Something to think about. I know that's a strong statement, and I don't mean for it to be offensive. I just mean for it to be thought-provoking. Anything else? I don't know of any that have stopped meeting. That I'm not saying there's not any. I know that there's a lot that are changing the way they do. I know of one congregation in particular. I'm thinking of one congregation right now in particular. On Sunday mornings, they don't have Bible school, but they have an elongated worship of about an hour and a half. So they do more singing, maybe a little bit longer thought for the Lord's Supper. Preaching is about 30 minutes. It's about the same. And but then on Sunday nights they have Bible class, Bible school. So everybody's different. Everybody's changing. Some aren't. You know, there's a lot of things that go on and with people and all. So, but it is not. Let me say this. This is the common problem in every congregation I know of. I don't know of anybody that's more on Sunday night or equal on Sunday night than they are on Sunday morning. Burns is about 200, and yeah, they do have some stuff on Sunday nights. Well, they've just changed in the last month. It's just another way of meeting, another time of meeting. I don't know the history behind it. We became a more mobile society. We could get there. It didn't take as big an effort to get there. We built more churches. We built more church buildings. You didn't have to travel this far. Anything else? Yeah, yeah, and you had longer periods, but then you didn't have Sunday night like Steve's asking. You didn't. It just kind of evolved over time, and we've lost our hunger. But there's also more opportunities. I mean, you can, right now, say tomorrow, if you want to, you can watch preaching, and I'm talking about Church of Christ preaching. I don't mean that used in a derogatory or denominational way. You can do it all day long. Pull up one YouTube after another, after another, after another. You can get on our webpage and listen to all the sermons and Bible classes of the past that are recorded on our webpage. There's more opportunities than there used to be. Anything else? Amen. Well, the encouragement, one of the things that we lose when we sit at home is we lose the encouragement from fellow brothers and sisters in Christ through song, through prayer, through fellowship. We lose that. And that's really, in many ways, that's what it's all about. It's, yeah, we come to worship, but that's what it's all about. Anything else? I can go for a long time on that. So, I'm sorry, what? It says, don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together. Of course, it's interesting what it says the verse before. What does it talk about before? I'm going to blame Jay's daddy on catching me on this. It talks about encouraging one another. I was sitting in a lecture one time with Jay's daddy, and it was on the idea of Hebrews 10:25, don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together as manner of some is. But it's tied to the idea of encouraging one another, and that's what worship is all about. So thank brother Jay Lockhart out in Texas for that great thought. It's a great thought. Let's bow for word prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day. Many blessings. Thankful for the opportunity to study your word. Thankful for your word and what it means to us. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us. Be with those that were announced this evening that were sick. Be with them. Watch over them. Be with Williams as he has surgery tomorrow. Be with others that were not mentioned, but that we know and love. We ask that you be with them and bless them and keep them. Be with us all and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.